So this is really kind of a transitional week. We're finished up with Nishime's textbook. Next week we'll be starting Gonzalez's textbook, but we're really looking at this week as kind of a sort of crossover between the 2 weeks and what links them together, and really think about it as a transition between the idea of thinking about popular culture, mainstream popular culture, and the idea of people creating their own forms of culture, which is really what we're going to be thinking about when we talk about the PCNs in the Day of the Dancer state, and really looking at specifically YouTube celebrities, YouTube personalities who are Asia Pacific American. And one of the key points that we want to think about is how that they're not sort of standing alone. This is not a new trend in Asia Pacific American culture. It's really actually kind of part of a continuum of Asia Pacific Americans as media creators in terms of filmmaking in the 1960s and 1970s, and then that sort of moving forward into the 2000s with people who have cell phone cameras and be able to do all these things on YouTube. That this is part of this kind of long tradition actually within Asia Pacific Americans as being willing to embrace this form of personal expression, and really also thinking about it as kind of this not a unidirectional form, but really kind of the cycle that goes along. Because when you think about how people become mainstream Asia Pacific American stars in popular culture, right? Take the case of someone like Aziz Ansari, who starts out basically as making his own YouTube videos. He gets posted, he starts doing stand-up, but then he gets discovered because he wants to become an actor. He gets the roles on network television shows, and then eventually with his particular fame star, he turns back around. He's creating his own series for Netflix, and then going back to creating kind of his own YouTube videos. So it's this cycle of not merely just being sort of like making it and then never going back to this idea of creating your own image or creating your own work. So even thinking about someone like Michelle Pham. Michelle Pham hasn't given up making YouTube makeup tutorial videos simply because she's got her own cosmetics line and has appeared in Dr. Pepper commercials, right? She's still making those particular videos. And again, one of the things that we're going to be doing for this week is going to be looking at the reading for this week is Lori Quito Lopez's. It's a chapter out of her Asian American media producers, media creators, and the chapter is specifically on people who are YouTube celebrities. So that's the required reading for this week. It's a PDF. It's available on Beachboard. There's also going to be some supplemental YouTube videos I'm going to ask you to watch again from Asia Pacific Americans to give you some context for that particular reading, but it's also going to be tied to the assignments, the discussion questions, which we'll get to at the end of the lectures. Okay. So thinking about this history, again, think about this contextualization. Again, as I mentioned before, Asia Pacific Americans have been part of this larger idea of creating, visual culture from the 60s and 70s, and even before that, right? Asia Pacific Americans, as I mentioned in prior weeks, were not simply on the outside of Hollywood or on the outside of acting, and sort of like just stumbled onto it in the last 10, 15, 20 years, right? They've actually been part of Hollywood really since the the inception of Hollywood in the 1900s. And you think about the silent era. And what's different about the 1960s is that this really does start to emerge from the ethnic studies movements, right? The idea of people who are starting to come onto college campuses and then learn the craft of filmmaking, and then realize that filmmaking itself is not merely something that is there for the idea of making profit, but when these people are going to school and they are also in a setting that is politically active in terms of getting things like the third world strikes going, or protesting conditions in their own neighborhoods, they see the cinema as an element to this idea of contributing back to the community. It's not merely one thing, right? It's actually one of several elements of how you give back to your community. Things like ethnic studies programs, but also things like community healthcare, right? Providing healthcare for the elderly, thinking about providing legal aid for people who need advice in terms of housing disputes, or having to deal with the criminal justice system, or things like free lunch programs. So these are all kind of larger individual efforts, which are all part of the same idea of how do you give back to your community. And for Asia Pacific Americans, the idea of documenting and filming and then showing people what the conditions are like in their particular communities, or what the different experiences of Asian Pacific Americans are, is part of this larger idea of how do you contribute to life in the community. And again, as I mentioned, it's actually emerging in the 1960s primarily because it's coming out of affirmative action. Like the idea that with affirmative action, and you have the opening of access to universities and colleges to Asian Pacific American students in larger numbers. Again, they had been attending, they were not prohibited from attending, but the numbers are increasing steadily, primarily because of affirmative action. They're actually accepting more Asian Pacific Americans. And with that, and with the idea of student activism in places like San Francisco State, Berkeley, Harvard, Long Beach State, right? These are, giving them, avenues to not only learn about their own histories, but also then to realize, well, how can they then portray their own histories, how they can document their own communities. And the other side of that is that not only are they filming it, but they're trying to figure out ways to actually, disseminate this particular information. Who's going to be able to see these movies? Who's going to be able to see these documentaries that they're creating about, their own communities, these stories about their own communities? And the reality is that the only outlet for them was going to be something like public television, like PBS. But for the first 20 years of its existence, public television was really kind of, again, not necessarily, by intention, but almost, what they call de facto segregation. It was because of the fact that so many people who are contributing to public television and providing the programming were in fact white, because, again, the access to facilities, access to filmmaking was limited in that way. When people are starting to, come to the universities, learn how to make these documentaries, and increasingly they're going to be African American, Asian American, Chicano, Latino, Native American, they're going to say, well, how do we get this particular, message? How do we get our videos out to, our films out to a wider audience? And of course, for them, it's going to be public television, because public television not only provides them the outlet, it also opens up access to things like funding. You can get contributions, you can get, apply for grants, you can apply for, specific filmmaker programs. So these are things that are then available for them through the avenue of public television. And again, this enables them to widen their potential audiences, rather than showing at these small independent film festivals where you might be able to reach maybe 100, 200 people at the max. With the exposure on public television, now you've got an audience that can number in the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, so on and so forth. And of course, that means that you can then have a wider audience, and then you can then get more funding for your next project and continue on in that way. So this is really part of that process of affirmative action. The other thing that happens is that when these filmmakers are starting to organize and start to realize that they're not the only ones, actually a community of them, they start to form these really, really specifically community-based organizations that will allow like-minded filmmakers, and not just filmmakers, but also people who are going to be, the technicians, people who are film editors, sound editors, people who are, cameramen, right? People who are, have the technical skills, but maybe not necessarily, the desire to simply make their own films, but they want to be able to contribute in this particular way. They are able to then collectively form and find a way to actually meet and organize and, again, contribute to the idea of creating media for the community. And these community-based organizations are not only, providing this particular space for filmmakers to meet and think about their ideas, but also to then apply for funding, and collectively then also put on things like film festivals locally so that they can showcase their particular work, and then recruit other people to showcase and exhibit their work from across the nation. And so these are the institutions that start these particular film festivals that you see in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Washington, D.C. And these organizations have been around for 30, 40 years now, and one of their hallmark events every year was going to be something like a film festival. So you have San Francisco Asian American Film Festival, you have the Los Angeles Asia Pacific Film Festival, you have one in San Diego, and these are all created, organized, and held by these media institutions that have been in existence for, again, 40, going on to 50 years now. The other thing that these particular media art centers do is also they provide education for future filmmakers. So they provide training programs for, not only high school students, but also for college students. And then in some place like Los Angeles and visual communications, they've actually provided training programs for senior citizens to then pick up and, learn how to use and shoot, videos on their own cell phones. So this is part of that process of how do you then create the idea of a media-based community within these specific locales. And again, it builds from a larger ideology. And this is a quote from René Pena, who was one of these early filmmakers from the early 1970s and is currently a professor at UCLA in Asian American Studies. She asked this question, right? Who's going to actually do this? Who's going to tell the stories of Asia Pacific America? Are we going to be the ones, or are we going to simply allow the way that it's been done in the past, where we're going to let others, in this case, Hollywood or other, documentary filmmakers, tell the stories about us? And with that comes all those particular caveats in terms of what do they understand, what do they not understand, how do they represent us, will they misrepresent us? And this is René Pena. And so one of the first things that she does is actually, as a student, she starts to document, these protests in the 1970s. This is a protest against the closure of the International Hotel in San Francisco, which was a residential hotel for elderly Filipino migrant workers who are now retired. It was basically a retirement hotel. And at the time, San Francisco was going through a process of gentrification. They were going to, this was at the time that they were building the new Transamerica Pyramid. And this is how long ago it was. That building had not yet been built yet. So they were going to tear down the I Hotel. And this was a place that was, again, affordable housing for Filipino, migrant film farm workers who had come to the United States in the 1930s and 1940s, but of course now they were in their 70s and 80s and really had nowhere else to live. Right, they were living on really limited incomes, and so it was a protest to keep this particular residence open for these elderly Filipinos. And so she documents this, and she's part of this particular process of documenting this particular and protesting, and part of this particular demonstration. It becomes a film by Curtis Choi called Fall of the I Hotel. And really what these films are starting to do in the early 1970s are really thinking about this idea of, well, who's going to be at the center of our stories, right? Who's actually going to be the focus? Is it going to be just the same old characters, the same old individuals? And thinking about, well, how do we start to tell more stories about people of color, right? Asian Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, Chicanos, Latinos, but also women. And then eventually it's also thinking about, not just, heterosexuals, but thinking about homosexuals, transgender, and also thinking about not just looking at middle class, but also thinking not just about, the elites, but also thinking about working class identities. So all these things are being sort of thrown together as being part of this larger, focus for filmmaking in the Asia Pacific American community. And so they're going to be affected by a large number of different events, right? Things like the San Francisco State, the Study Strike that we've already seen about, organizations like, the Young Lords, who are Chicano, organization, or, looking to, again, contribute back to the community. Black Power movement, the idea of black cinema, again, black independent cinema, which had existed really from the 1920s, but had then sort of died and then sort of reemerged in the 1970s. Right, all these other sort of public demonstrations like Chicano school blowouts, Vietnam War protests, and also the Chicano arts movements, which really was a direct outgrowth of the Chicano school blowouts, because you have high school students in East LA who are saying we don't want to simply be tracked into industrial arts. We want to be artists. We want to be filmmakers, and those people then create their own art collective, something like OSCO in the Chicano community in Los Angeles. And so all these things are going to be inspirations for Asian American filmmakers as well. And they're going to say, well, why can't we do these things ourselves? And of course, they will then do it. And of course, René Pena is going to be one of these people who was, again, in the early 1970s through the late 1970s, as she's going to school, is starting to then realize that this is something that is there for the community. And so one of her first works is really this documentary called Who Killed Vincent Chin, which documents the murder of Vincent Chin, who was a Chinese American immigrant, adopted from China, grew up in the United States, so identifies primarily as American, but he's working in Detroit as a draftsman. He gets murdered on, basically during the night of his bachelor party by two out of work, auto workers in Detroit at a time when the Detroit audio industry is going in decline in 1982. And the question is, well, what happens to those particular individuals, because they are essentially plead guilty to manslaughter, and their sentence is then reduced to probation and a fine. And so the documentary then follows the aftermath of that particular verdict and how the Chinese American community and then the larger Asian American community starts to rally around trying to get justice for Vincent Chin after his 1983 murder. And the film Who Killed Vincent Chin comes out in 1987 and again gets a premiere in public television. But it's a particular examination of media portrayals of Chinese, Japanese, and Asians, and this anti-Asian hysteria that exists in the 1980s, which may have contributed to the climate that leads to Vincent Chin's death. So this is really kind of the early part of, again, in the 1980s, as you get kind of the second wave of Asian Pacific American filmmaking. And then if you think about YouTube, it's kind of like maybe the third or fourth wave in reality. So that's it for part one. We're going to come back and watch part two. And again, we'll try to connect back the readings to what we just talked about.